Welcome to Scale Model Workshop. In my build review of the Eduard Hawker Tempest MkII. If you've built the Eduard Tempest MkV kit, then much about the MkII will be familiar. The kit's made up of 5 frames from the original Tempest V kit, along with 3 new frames containing the MkII fuselage, wings, ailerons, engine front, and other Mark-specific details. The kit provides decals for 6 different aircraft. Also included is a fret of colored photo etch as well as paint masks. Looking over the kit, one thing I especially like is the way Eduard has molded the cowl along with the fuselage. It's a design from a time of simpler kits, but very well done to current standards. And doing it this way maintains better alignment and it minimizes unnecessary separate subassemblies. The redesigned wing has some hits and misses. In the original Tempest V kit, the aft joint of the wing halves was oddly placed well forward of the trailing edge, and the height of the two was uneven. In this kit, Eduard has taken the joint back to a more familiar distance from the trailing edge, bringing it to the standard of the Spitfire Mk IX. The design of how the flap meets up with the wing fillet has been completely redesigned in a more conventional manner, eliminating the mismatch of the Tempest V kit. On the negative side of the new wing, the gate design's a bit odd and in some places clumsy. Cleaning up the attachments will demand a bit of finesse to minimize the damage and maintain as much of the detail as possible. Another aspect of many modern kits is the Pebbly surface finish. In some kits it's hardly noticeable, like this Tamiya Spitfire wing. The edges around the recessed detail are sharp and distinct. On the other hand, the Eduard wing has quite a bit of texture, and much of what would be exquisite detail is lost amongst the grain. Assembling the cockpit's a familiar experience, as it's exactly the same as the Tempest V kit. Neither of my kits suffered from any breakage of the sidewall tubing, as was common with the Tempest V kits, and it seems like Eduard has altered something either in the mix of the styrene or the molding process so that the plastic is a little less brittle. One other interesting aside about the color of the cockpit comes from an extensive article on the Tempest in the February 1973 issue of Scale Models. The article is authored by a man whose drawings are most associated with the Tempest, Arthur Bentley. The article also featured his drawings, as well as an additional page on Hawker Tempest colors by Bob Jones. The article is very specific to say that only some of the Series 1 MkVs had gray-green cockpits, while the rest were painted night. The seat was generally left unpainted or painted night, although a few were seen in gray-green. It's almost universal that modelers paint the cockpit of British World War II day fighters gray-green. And despite having the information from this article, I used gray-green on my scratch-built Series 2 Tempest MkV many years ago. It certainly lightens up the cockpit and makes things more interesting. The instructions for the kit spec out gray-green with some black on the uppermost portion of the sidewalls and rear armor. I certainly make no claim at being an authority on the Tempest, and I'll leave it up to others to debate the topic of the cockpit color, but I did want to share this information. Before buttoning up the fuselage, there are a few other issues you may need to attend to. In both my kits, the locating pins for the engine front and exhaust stubs were short-shot on the starboard fuselage half. I find it odd that these weren't made more robust. In any case, I took the measurement off of an existing pin on the port side and cemented in some more substantial tabs all the way around. The exhaust pins are less of an issue because the existing ones are pretty useless. If you follow the instructions, you don't place the exhaust stubs till step 25, when the model's nearly complete. If it worked out, it'd be great for painting. All I can say is good luck cementing the exhaust as per the instructions. If Eduard really wanted to make this work, It would have been better to extend the back end of the stubs and include a separate mounting trough. I wound up removing the pins and just cementing the stubs by eye while the fuselage was open. Another issue I encountered with the forward fuselage is the weakness at the point of the engine vent. It can easily bend and crack, for instance while you're trying to hold it in the right position for a video. I cemented some internal reinforcement with styrene strip, cemented with cyanoacrylate and acrylic powder. I would avoid too much solvent cement, as it would only weaken the area more. The female portion of the vertical stabilizer locating pin was also short shot. This Mark V tail shows what it should have looked like. While it's not essential, it would have helped in alignment and establishing the width of the stabilizer. I found the joint between the two vertical stabilizer halves slightly less tight than on the Mark V kit. It helps to make sure the mating surface is flat, and you may need to lightly adjust the triangular cutout. Even with a little tweaking, the two halves still weren't quite aligned. Again, the Mark V didn't have this issue. It's worth noting that the cap over the leading edge of the stabilizer is actually overlapped and not particularly prominent. I simulated it on my scratch-build Tempest with a heavy layer of lacquer primer. I realized the difficulty in molding an invisible seam against a raised panel. However, it can be done. One example of this is Tamiya's Spitfire Mark I, where the insert for the cockpit side is undetectable. The fuselage was finely buttoned up, and the fit between the two halves is generally very good right out of the box. As molded, the vent on the top of the cowling had slightly more curvature than the surrounding panel and was loose in the cutout. I opened up the curve a little bit and it pretty much went right to place. As you can see, it looks very impressive for a cutout spanning two fuselage halves. Eduard corrected the design of the Mark V cockpit surround by eliminating the extension around the windscreen molding. Unfortunately, the fit of the new surround is very disappointing. It seems like it suffers from the same error in curvature as the engine vent. However, trying to bend it outward is pretty limited, so you're left with a significant difference in height between the two pieces. This is somewhat obscured when the canopy is open, but it's a major issue with the canopy closed. The front portion of the surround is supported by two stops, parts E15, that should have been cemented in place back in step 14. The whole affair is a bit makeshift and poorly designed. I found myself still having to play around with the height of the front portion. The only two reasons I can see for making all this a separate piece is the detail on the top of the rear deck and make it easier to install the gun sight mount. So for that, Eduard chose to ruin the integrity of the fuselage. It would have been much better to just make the rear deck detail and rail a separate piece and mold the rest with the fuselage. The wheel wells are made up from all the same pieces as the Mark V kit. After assembling several of these, I developed a bit of a routine. I recommend gathering all the pieces together and clean them up ready for assembly. Start with the back of the well. The two vertical supports provide a very nice positive key. After that, you can virtually close your eyes and drop in the rest of the pieces. I finish up with the heavy bulkhead that has the mount for the gear. This has to be snapped in under a bit of molded detail on the forward wall. When all together, the stock wheel wells of the Eduard Tempest kits provide very nice detail. Typically, I build my 48 scale aircraft with the gear up, and I almost always find it necessary to just cut new doors from 30,000 styrene sheet. But if you want to build this kit with the gear up, you stand a fighting chance using the stock doors because they actually fit pretty well. In either case, I do this before cementing the wing halves together. The wing halves made up better than the Mark V kit, but they still need a fair amount of tweaking and test fitting to get the intakes and leading edge to mate up properly. Front on, the intake cutouts line up very well. If you're willing to put in the time, you can get the seam to close up nicely without any filler. Why manufacturers persist in using cutouts for the wing guns is beyond me. They never fit, and it destroys the integrity of the leading edge, as well as the surrounding engraved detail. It would be much better to provide appropriate pilot holes along with separate well-done barrels. Maybe it's presumptuous, but I'd reckon most modelers who would choose to purchase an Eduard kit are perfectly capable of drilling a few holes. Rather than trying to fill and blend in the kit inserts with dissimilar material, my typical solution is to replace the inserts with styrene stock. In this case, the upper and lower cutouts are a different depth. This makes it necessary to use two separate pieces. You can turn this to an advantage by blackening one surface with a felt tip marker. Make sure that when cemented in place, both the center line of the wing halves and the insert line up. Now as the inserts reduce to shape, the center line will provide an excellent guide for spotting the gun ports. As I mentioned before, I typically build my 48 scale plastic kits with the gear up, but for this review I needed to have the gear down. Rather than build two complete models, I decided to make the wing removable and swap it out later. I cemented a tab to the rear wing assembly so that the wing just slides in. The front portion of the wing assembly virtually snapped to place, and I added a similar tab here. As you can see, the wing mates up perfectly. The kit includes new two-piece ailerons, but I found the original one-piece ailerons actually fit better. However, my experience with Eduard kits, better's a relative term. With either set of ailerons, they're a bit too long for the cutout. If you use the one-piece ailerons like I did, you'll need to remove a little bit of material from the inboard surfaces. The two-piece set need tweaking from both sides. How Eduard molded the rudder hollow is a marvel. However, it cracks just looking at it. All of mine were either cracked on the sprue or during very light handling in the cleanup process. I ended up flowing in some cyanoacrylate and acrylic powder. I would recommend doing this right off regardless whether you see a crack or not. In order to get the horizontal stabilizer halves to mate up properly, they'll need a bit of refinement. It was easier to just remove the locating pins and sand everything flat. I found the slots for the stabilizers too small and needed to be opened up with a file. The model was blocked up to ensure that the stabilizers were cemented parallel. Here again, the kit includes new two-piece elevators, but I couldn't see any difference in detail, so I used the original one-piece elevators because they fit perfectly. The main gear and doors on the Eduard Tempest are extremely well done. However, the mounting's a bit sloppy. In my build review of the Mark V kit, I show how I used a makeshift jig to steady the gears while they were cemented. Sometime after I put up the review, a subscriber emailed me saying that his kit didn't have as much slop, and he was able to find a definite seat that provided a good mounting position. Since this is a review of the stock kit, I thought I'd give it a try. I found that indeed, if you apply pressure at the base of the gear, it'll find a definite seat. So with the gear in place, I applied some Tamiya extra thin cement to the joint and applied pressure to the base to keep it seated until the cement was steady. The joint was later reinforced with a drop of Zap-A-Gap. I also found that when the gear was cemented this way, the retraction linkage could just be snapped to place. The Mark II kit includes the later style linkage. My real question was how accurate was the mounting position, because so much of the Tempest's beefy look is based on the stance. Here's the model in profile, and then overlaid with the Bentley drawing. The model's gear is angled more steeply, and it's a bit taller than how Bentley's shown it. To my eye, that's basically what I see. How much of a difference it makes is obviously up to you, but I personally think that correcting the angle is very easy with the makeshift jig, and the height can be taken care of by just flattening the tires, which I would do anyway. Similar to the Mark V kit, the design of the propeller assembly feels a bit like an afterthought. The instructions have you cement the gear case fairing to the engine in step 12, but believe me, you'll need it for step 34, especially if you elect to use the larger propeller F22. Eduard only provides one very small locating pin, which by itself doesn't afford any sort of positive location. So when gluing up the prop, it helps to have the gear case fairing in hand. When it's all together, the spinner isn't very steady against the gear case fairing. To tighten things up, I applied a thickness of Zap-A-Gap to the shaft. So here's the model all up, as you can expect to see it out of the box. Like the Eduard Mark V kit, I think the model looks an excellent representation of the Tempest. The scale cord and thin trailing edges of the wing, vertical stabilizer, and horizontal stabilizers greatly contribute to a realistic model. However, since this is a review of a plastic model kit, the bigger question is how does the kit stack up in the four-cigar matrix, and here this kit presents a unique problem. Some things are very well done, and some things leave you scratching your head, which actually seems to be my experience with Eduard kits in general. Once all together, the model looks great, but as a kit it falls short. I don't believe it makes for an honest review to fluff off construction issues with a vague statement like, it just takes a little bit of modeling 101. Who's modeling 101? What might seem basic to me might not seem so simple to someone else. In any case, I felt it necessary to create a new class that I'm calling the old stogie. This category bridges the space between something like the Airfix Spitfire Mark XIV and the Tamiya Mark I Spitfire. So for design and engineering, I gave this kit an old stogie. Issues like the cockpit surround, ailerons, rudder, weak fuselage structure, and others seem almost elementary, and it keeps this kit from winning a cigar. For molding and production, I gave this kit another old stogie. Short shots, grainy surface texture, poor fitting locating pins and wing joins keep this kit from winning a cigar. Same goes for overall parts fit. Some things are outstanding, and some things just aren't acceptable. It gets an old stogie. However, I think the overall look and scale are spot on, and if you're willing to slow down, take your time fitting and tweaking, you'll be rewarded with a very nice model. All up as a completed model in today's market, I give the Eduard Tempest MkII a cigar. But there's a reason that plastic model kits came to be and rose to popularity in the first place. Kits like this Tempest missed the mark. About 2/3 of the way through most Eduard kits, I find myself just wanting to be done with it because you get tired of fixing things. It's okay to have a complex kit, but parts need to fit. I explore this a little further in my postscript video, What's Important About a Plastic Model Kit. In the meantime, I hope you found some of the information here useful for selecting the right kit or making it a smoother building experience. So long for now, and I'll see you next time.